Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, friends of Pisai. My name is Diego Sarrio, and I am the Dean of Studies of Pisai. On behalf of the Rector, Reverend Valentino Cotini, who cannot be with us today, the staff members and professors of Pisai, I welcome you all to the first public lecture of our 2017 series. Those of you who are familiar with our series of lectures know that we offer them in different languages, English, Italian, French, and that we always try to invite speakers who have distinguished themselves in the field of Islamic studies and/or Muslim-Christian relations. The title of today's lecture might have surprised some of us who associate the concept of theology of liberation mainly with the experience of the Catholic Church in South America. Is there an Islamic theology of liberation? To speak on this topic, we have called upon the most appropriate person, Professor Farid Esack. Professor Esack was born in 1959 in Cape Town, South Africa. He studied Quranic studies in Karachi, Pakistan, and then completed a doctoral degree in Quranic hermeneutics at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Later on, he pursued postdoctoral studies in biblical hermeneutics at the St. Georgen Graduate School of Philosophy and Theology in Frankfurt, Germany. Professor Esack is currently Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, and visiting professor in religious studies at the University of Hamburg in Germany. And he is a prolific writer. Among his several books, I would like to mention 4 in particular because the titles already tell us a lot about the author and his interests. And some of them you will find them outside in case you are interested in acquiring them. Quran, Liberation and Pluralism, an Islamic Perspective on Interreligious Solidarity Against Oppression, published in 1997. On Being a Muslim, Finding a Religious Path in the World Today, which appeared in 1999. The Quran, a User's Guide, published in 2005, and one of the most recent ones, Whose Quran? A Concise Guide to Progressive Islam, published in 2009. We are very grateful to Professor Esack for his kindness in accepting to talk to us tonight about this important topic, to which we shall listen with great interest. And now, Professor Esack, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much, colleagues, friends, brothers and sisters, for coming out to listen to me tonight. I was, a couple of days ago, I was in Vienna, where I had a chance to speak to colleagues in the Department of Theology. It's a Catholic department at Innsbruck of Theology, and so it was actually the first time in many years that I had the opportunity to address a group of largely Catholic theologians. I didn't go into where I want to go into now at that gathering, but it is perhaps the first opportunity that I have in a very long time to just reiterate my indebtedness to the Catholic tradition. There are many things that shape us. There's our context that shape us. There is our identity, my identity as a black person in apartheid South Africa. There is our gender that shapes us. There is, I spent 8 years in a madrasa in Pakistan, a Deobandi madrasa, that later on became the theological heart of the Taliban, in Pakistan. But like all of us know, there are also parallel elements in our lives that don't often appear as the dominant strands, but they work in us, and some of us may say that the Holy Spirit works in us through those other strands in our lives. The quieter strands, sometimes the more subversive strands in our lives. And so while I was a student in the Darul Uloom, in this madrasa, exceptionally conservative, but it was just a great place for learning. It was a very, very great place for learning, fine. You can challenge the relevance of studying medieval deductive logic or inductive logic, or early Islamic philosophy, or when your most modern textbooks are about 6 centuries old. You can challenge the relevance of it, but you can't deny the depth of and the value of traditional learning. Of course, the challenges of our institutions are to make the connections between that traditional learning and the world wherein we live today. We didn't make any of those connections, okay? But here I was, and I was a child of that product for about 8 years. I went home the first time after 6 years non-stop of being in this place. Found South Africa completely bewildering. I was completely disoriented and had to flee back. It's like, you know, when prisoners, when they come out and they blink at the light and they've got to run back into their prisons, I had to run back. And I stayed there for another year, 2 years before I was ready to return to South Africa. And in the middle of this, I found ways of surviving. I was enormously enriched by my experience. I have written about this, so it's not as if I'm sullying the name of my institution or being unkind to my tradition. But I have written extensively about how thoroughly inhuman my educational process was. And in this inhumanness of this educational process, it's not unlike the Catholic institutions in the 19th century and before that. And I don't know, some seminarians may still say, well, you'll find resonances of those seminaries still around, but I don't want to go there at the moment. And in the middle of this, and this is off point, and I must be careful now that I don't eat into the time allocated to my lecture. And in the middle of this, I survived this institution through 3 elements. It was a combination of shrewdness and cunning. That was the one, shrewdness and cunning, that I survived this. And the other was courage. So it was shrewdness and cunning on the one hand, and then it was courage and determination. That was the second one. But the third was my engagement with a group of Christians who worked and thrived on the margins of the church. There was a very prominent LaSalle brother, Brother Norman, Allahu yarhamhu, God have mercy on his soul, who passed away 2 years ago. And for me, Brother Norman was just the personification of, in many ways, for Christians, Jesus Christ was God personified on earth. Brother Norman was Christ personified in our world today. And so around Brother Norman, a group of us had formed called Breakthrough, and this group worked inside the church, sometimes to the annoyance of the church very often, but it worked with the Punjabi Christians, who are amongst the most marginalized minorities in the Muslim world. And very little attention international attention focuses on the oppression, the social oppression that Punjabi Christians face inside the Muslim world. Horrific crimes that they experience on a daily basis. It only culminates now and then in the accusation of blasphemy and death sentences and so on for blaspheming the Quran or blaspheming the Prophet. So it was in that context of working with these people while I was a seminarian in a Taliban-esque madrasa. So it was a subversive, parallel, schizophrenic kind of existence that I learned to marry my own love for the Quran, my own commitment to Islam, to marry that with another part of myself that I could not deny. And this is that a deep concern that I've always had for who is being left out. When we meet, when we gather, who is not at the table? I've always had this obsession. Who is not there who should be there? So when I see a table of 3 or 4 male speakers, I will ask, why isn't there a woman? When we are at a gathering and I see there are only white people, I will ask, where are the black people? Or I see only, this is a perpetual obsession that I've had since I was a child. And so it was this experience, this engagement with the La Salle brothers, with the Little Sisters of Jesus, with the Dominicans. And so it wasn't an interfaith theology. It wasn't a dialogical, it wasn't a dialogue, an interreligious dialogue that drove me to this. It was our concern for prisoners in Karachi Central Jail. It was our concern for the sweeper community, the Jamadar community, the community, because the Christian, the darker-skinned Christians, they were consigned a social role in society as cleaners. And the cleaners, the sweepers, they were the personification of dirt. So nobody could touch them and they couldn't touch anybody. They couldn't use the utensils that the Muslims were using. They couldn't eat with Muslims. They couldn't drink water from the wells of the Muslims. And a quick one, in one day, the Evangelische Kirche Deutschland, the Evangelical Church in Germany, built a well for the Christian community because the Muslims had denied the Christians access to their wells. And then you know what these good followers of Christ did? They immediately denied Hindus access to their water well. So there we go. That was a very long introduction, people. I'll try to cut here and there in my talk, but I did want to just reflect on my indebtedness to this community for and these ideas of mine later on became very central in Islamic liberation theology and was the fundamental impulse, theological impulse that drove Muslim participation in the South African struggle against liberation. And so it had a huge impact on Muslim consciousness and Muslim ideas in the struggle against apartheid. I wanted to reflect also not just on liberation theology, but on the departure, the rupture between progressive Islam and an Islamic theology of liberation. So I want to talk about Islamic liberation theology, but I also want to explain how it parts company with liberal theology, that is often now called progressive theology. So shortly after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 by the United States, an acquaintance of mine received a telephone call from the office of somebody who was then the Secretary of Defense, Condoleezza Rice. She was inquiring, or she was Secretary of State probably, inquiring about the possibility of her meeting with me. I was then based at Harvard University. This friend of mine was aware that I was opposed to imperialism in general and to the United States and its policies, both domestic and foreign. And he suggested to the person from Rice's office that I actually may not be excited about such a meeting. I may not be up to the idea of such a meeting. The person was somewhat taken aback and said, why on earth wouldn't he want to meet her? Isn't he a progressive Muslim? My acquaintance laughed at the idea that when it comes to Muslims, the only requirement to be progressive is to be critical of traditional religious authority. You could be politically right-wing, but you only need to be critical of Muslim traditional authority. And he correctly understood that in the middle of this war, I wasn't keen on meeting Condoleezza Rice. I didn't believe that she was really interested in a genuine dialogue, but that they were simply in search of acquiescent intellectual partners in a game where conversation and dialogue were mere additional weapons in the arsenal to entrench United States global hegemony. So until the events of September the 11th in the United States, for example, I was quite content with being described as a progressive Muslim. After the attacks on the United States, the term progressive was speedily and consciously appropriated by many Muslims desperate to present themselves as different from the barbarian Muslims who inflicted this injury onto the United States. And more significantly, it was used to describe Muslims who were friends of the West, or friendly towards the West, without any critique of the hegemonic impulses of the West, and its selective, simultaneous support for terrorism on the one hand, and denunciation of terrorism on the other. And so the first thing that I want to make clear, liberation theology isn't about fitting in with Western values and fitting in with a Western vision of the world or with Pax Americana. And very often in our dialogues and in our search for Muslim conversational partners, it is easy to forget that we are looking for co-sojourners with us in theological journeys, in journeys that will take us closer to narrowing the gap between our faith and our lives and our communities. It is very often easy to consider just, so these folks are Western friendly, therefore they must be open to our theologies. You do need to then ask, what's the problem with your theologies? That your theology is seen as synonymous with white civilization and with Western civilization and with power, if you confuse who you are looking for as a dialogue partner. Now, before this, as I said, I was happy to describe myself as progressive. I also had described myself as a progressive Islamist, which was a perfect fit in the South African context. In the late 1990s, an internationalist group that I co-founded came up with what we had then defined as progressive Islam. And this, I'm reading from this definition now. It is synonymous with liberation theology for us. Progressive Islam is that understanding of Islam and its sources which comes from and is shaped. So it both comes from and it shapes a commitment within, a commitment to transform society from an unjust one where people are the mere objects of exploitation by governments, socio-economic institutions, and unequal relationships. The new society will be a just one, where people are the subjects of history, the shapers of their own destiny, and then very important, in the full awareness that all of humankind is in a state of returning to God, and that the universe was created as a sign of God's presence. And so the world that we see is not just a material entity that we see. Human beings are not just social beings. Human beings are not just homo economicus, economic beings, but human beings are returnees unto God. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Not from God we come, and unto God we shall return. But from God we come, and unto God we are returning. So human beings, every minute of our lives that we pass is a minute closer to returning to God. The attacks of the Twin Towers in October, in September in New York, in September 2001, brought many different tensions in the Islamic world together, and this heightened the tempo of what is this progressive Islam. There is a book that many of you may be familiar with, edited by Omid Safi, Progressive Muslims on Gender Justice and Pluralism. I have an article in there as well. It's a collection of essays dealing with various aspects of liberal Islam. This and the formation of another group in the United States, the Progressive Muslim Union of North America, in 2002, it contributed significantly, I think, to the loss of radicality of the term progressive Muslims. On the board of this new body that they formed, for example, they had the likes of two people, Sime and Malik Hassan, who were the founders of Muslims for Bush. And this organization had raised more than $1 million for George Bush's election campaign. They had people on the board who were atheists, who had denounced Islam many years ago already. And then they had fairly conservative, right-wing elements at that time, certainly like Farid Esack, a media commentator. But all these people had in common that they had problems with Muslim authority. So as earlier on, progressive Islam was defined as people who were interested in the creation of a new just world, committed to the text, the Quran, the Sunnah, and wanting to understand the world through our commitment to our religious traditions, and wanting to seek a place for the marginalized through this. It now became whom of us can fit in with the new requirement of the empire to be a good Muslim, in Mahmoud Mamdani's words. So we argue that for us Islam is a faith that affirms justice, compassion, and diversity. It, however, is also one that challenges the manifestations of injustice, as well as its socio-economic systemic causes. Islam for us is a faith that will refuse to exist in partnership or in a relationship of moderation with injustice and imperialism. So the parting of ways between the liberals, who were now in public control of the term progressive, and the progressive Muslims, was inevitable. September the 11th reflected a tectonic shift in Muslim thinking. The extent and the ferocity of the battle for the minds of Muslims, the desperation of many Muslims living in the global north, or beholden to it to prove that they are loyal natives to the empire, was intense. Now, Muslim liberalism was not inconsequential support of the media. Lots of US governmental financial support received a significant shot in the arm. From my perspective, the task to civilize the Muslim barbarians was in full swing, not only in the United States, but globally. So traditional Islam, the ordinary ulama, and Islamism, even in its non-violent forms, such as the Muslim Brotherhood and its different manifestations in different countries, were on the back foot. And some quietist Sufism and liberal forms of Islam were now on the march. It was now the time for the quietist Sufis. It was now the time for liberal Islam to emerge, and they were led by Muslim academics, non-Muslim think tanks, and by governments, Muslim governments and otherwise. Now, one scholar at that time, Farid Esack, he pointed out to the challenge that the progressive Muslim, the Muslim whose heart inclines towards the marginalized, was now facing. And he says, but the danger we face today is that there is no good version of Islam being promoted by Washington and the powers that be in the West. This is the genetically modified version of Islam that is toothless, spineless, and gutless, and can only parrot the litany of the West uncritically. For such Muslims, critical engagement with the West effectively means doing whatever their Western paymasters pay and tell them to do. By doing so, they have not only discredited themselves, but also the agenda and project of progressive Islam itself. So this subsuming of the term progressive into liberalism in some ways also signified the triumph of the power of the United States over other more local forces, including indigenous forms of liberative Islamic praxis. Muslims who were troubled by the many different forms of injustices, and there are many, besetting their own societies, ranging from gender injustices, discrimination against religious and sexual minorities, the religious authoritarianisms. Those Muslims were increasingly dependent on US-based Muslim academics to provide them with the ideas to resolve the very real tension between loyalty, love for, fidelity to Islam on the one hand, and the desire to live consciously, contemporaneously inside the world today. For me, the loss sustained in our very bruising battle signaled that it was time to dump the label progressive Muslim and return to my South African origins and my Pakistani origins as a liberation theologian. Now let me tell you how I define Islamic liberation theology. Islamic first, it is that which privileges as its sources of inspiration the Quran, the Sunnah of Muhammad, the precedent of Muhammad, and the prophets who preceded him. So there is that connection to pre-Muhammadan Islam, of his companions and family. And so here there is an openness to non-Shia, to non-Sunni expressions of Islam and family, and the precedence of earlier Muslims or movements who also drew their inspiration from these sources. So it is in some ways an anti-Salafist position because of the acknowledgement of tradition. That it isn't just a question of just going back to the Quran and the Hadith, but there are the Jamaluddin Afghanis, there are the Badshah Khans, There are the Imam Shamils, there is the Abu Dhar al-Ghifari. So you see all of this inside this. So I acknowledge both fidelity to so-called normative Islam and to the idea that Islam has always been and continues to be shaped by the faithful and the struggle to give meaning to it. Islam simultaneously is, while it is continuously in a state of becoming. As for the term liberation, it is the process of ever deepening freedom from, and this is very important in the context of theology, two things: the exploitation and injustice of individuals and groups of people by others, and from the urgings of the lower self, the nafsul ammar. Because often in any theology that veers too close to the political, we ignore the question of the self and the responsibility of the transformation of the self. And the self as in the presence of God, the self as a returnee to God. And so the whole idea that liberation is also from the nafsul ammar, the lower self that urges you towards that which is not ethically sound, to that which in religious language we call sinful. While liberation may at some stages be correctly claimed to have been attained, for example, you speak about German liberation from Nazism, black South Africans from apartheid, liberation is never fully attained. We constantly become aware of deeper layers and understandings of oppressions and racism and our complicity in them. And we experience how earlier forms of more obvious forms of injustices morph into new ones, like slavery, for example. And now you look at the what is this clothing industry called that employs slave labor? There is a word for it. Sweatshops. And you look at the practice in sweatshops, for example. It's a modern form of slavery. Theology. The transcendent, Allah, the deity, God, or the divine. I always prefer the term the transcendent, and I may come back to that in a moment, is central to the very meaning of theology, defined by Augustine of Hippo as reasoning or discussion concerning the deity. The term can, however, be used for a variety of different disciplines pertaining to the transcendent. Muslims, the earlier term kalam, it is still widely used, even when the nature and the content of contemporary theological discourse has moved significantly away from the earlier connotations of the term. The Islamic term aqidah, the contemporary term, has more of a meaning of dogma attached to it. The closest to the English theology is probably ilahiyat, but it is much more in vogue in Turkish Islam. Theology is about God. There is, however, no discussion that is only about God. The fact is that the fact that it is not only about God does not make it less authentic as theology. People, socially located beings, are participants in this discussion, and so theology is also about people. Now, some may argue that liberation theology is really about the marginalization of God and the privileging of an-nas, the people, on the one hand, and the marginalized in the earth, the mustad'afuna fil ard, on the other. I would argue that the attempt to engage in discussion about God as God, without recognizing the socio-political context of such discourse, is invariably and inevitably located inside the power play involved. Liberation theology is about approaching our faith from the undersides of history. It is in some ways an attempt to retrieve religious authenticity from the powerful, to free it from the notion that it is irrevocably tied to the powerful. It also questions the notions of a final authenticity that can be neatly wrapped up in a creed. The claim of liberation theology is not that it leads to absolute authenticity. It leads to greater authenticity. Given the focus of liberation theology as its non-subjects, as the non-subjects of history, the marginalized, we insist that they contribute to determining the meaning of authenticity. Now, the moving impulses driving liberation theology in Islam has, such as the desperation for justice, a determination for freedom from all forms of oppression. This has always been evident in many forms of Islam and in Islamic history. The bottom line, before I mention a few examples, has quite simply been this. Now, of course, Islam, when we study Islamic history, we often study empires. We look at Islam in Baghdad, we look at Islam in Damascus, we look at Islam in the Ottoman Empire, and very many of the times our studies, it is partly shaped by the cosmopolitans or the urbans. It is very seldom that we look at the Islams of the margins as they are developed inside those Muslim societies. But theologically, it's a very simple idea, folks. That not a single prophet sent by God ever came into this world and asked, how do I fit in with the dominant structures? This is heresy. To want to claim that any of our prophets came into this world and said, how do I fit in? It doesn't mean that the converse is not necessarily true. That any maverick, any troublemaker, anybody that shouted off the top of his head from the marketplace was a prophet. I'm not saying any weirdo, any madman was a prophet. But I am saying that every single prophet that came into the world, not one of them asked, how do I fit in with the dominant structures? Prophets came and asked, how do I speak truth to power? And their success or failure was not measured by whether they ended their careers successfully. If this was the case, many of our prophets would have been total losers. They would have been total failures. So success and failure in prophetic language was never marked by whether you achieved a set of goals, but whether you spoke. Of course, بالحكمة, with wisdom, وموعظة للحسنة, and with good advice, وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن, and to argue with them in the methods in which we are best. So this was the primary impulse always of all prophetic religion. So the emergence of Islam itself may be seen as a revolt against oppression. More particularly, there's the revolt of Hussein ibn Ali against Yazid ibn Muawiyah, may be described as the pinnacle of such a movement in Islam. Individuals such as Prophet Muhammad, Hussein, Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, Uthman dan Fodio in West Africa, Imam Shamil from present-day Dagestan, Jamaluddin al-Asadabadi, Badshah Khan in undivided India, Malcolm X. These were some of the earlier articulators of this tendency in Islam. I would argue that it has been an ever-present impulse in Islam, although seldom articulated as liberation theology. At times, these were exemplified by movements, and at other times by individuals. And sometimes people said simply Islam. They've been described as revolutionary Islam, progressive Islam, in the Arabic world, Islam al-Yasar, invoked by somebody like Hassan Hanafi. In Syria, Mustafa al-Sibai, in the early 19th century, emerged as the leading advocate for a justice Islam. in Iran, Ayatollah Baqir al-Sadr espoused a political philosophy known as Wilayat al-Ummah, as distinct from Wilayat al-Faqih, and Ayatollah Mahmoud Ali Khani was described as, I quote, a representative of the tendency of many Shia clerics to blend Shia with socialist egalitarian ideals. And this impulse drew thousands of young socially committed Iranian Muslims to their public lectures. It was also in Iran that we saw the most articulate and courageous pioneer of the 20th century of Islamic liberation theology, Ali Shariati, 1933 to 77, emerging to become the expression of the progressive revolutionary consciousness that characterized the Iranian Revolution through the collective enthusiasm of people and inspiring revolutionary and socially conscious Muslims throughout the world, including South Africa. There are admittedly competing notions of Islamic liberation theology. Some have queried whether it can be properly described as a theology. For me, it is not something that can be developed from a purely theological basis. In fact, liberation theology denies the very idea of a purely theological or a purely secular. Like all human discourses, it is contaminated. And so along with feminist, Dalit, humanist, black theology, liberation theology proudly owns this contamination. Unlike postmodernity, which merely acknowledges contamination, liberation theology, with its clear preferential option for the marginalized, argues that the primary location of this contamination is the margins of society. Now, a significant problem in discussing Islamic liberation theology is that it is under-theorized. And much of the discussions on Islamic liberation theology conflates it with various other forms of liberal theology or with political Islam. The under-theorized Islamic discourse inevitably occupies an inferior position within the dominant discourse on knowledge and always functions as an object to the structures of empire. The objectified projection of Islam diminishes the complex theological understanding of believers and their lived experience. All these discourses underline the importance of finding the issues and debates within Islamic liberation theology. Contemporary Islamic discourse is framed as political Islam, intellectual Islam, or social movement perspectives of Islam. And there is an uncertainty in the framing of Islamic liberation theology within this flux of terms and categories, when the dominant categories rotate around fundamentalist, progressive, moderate, liberal, etc. And so one needs to contextualize all of this within the context of the dominant power. So all the terms that consciously employ the term liberation theology represents a departure of political Islam, a departure from political Islam, which started at the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1920, and it attempts to find a language of theology in the wake of oppression and tyranny. The language of political Islam, which developed in the 1920s, was primarily anti-colonial, and in a sense, shaped by the frame of colonialism itself. Islamic liberation theology, it can be argued, is both a break from and a continuation of political Islam with all its political and theological complexities. It is a continuation of political Islam because it stresses the political, social aspects of Islam. Yet, it is also a break from political Islam. Not only did it radically reinterpret the exclusivist claims of political Islam. The answer of political Islam to colonialism was Al-Islamu ya'la wa la yu'la alayh. Islam dominates and is never dominated. So the answer was these Western imperialist powers, they're bad for our societies. The answer to that is the reinvention of an imaginary Islamic empire. And so sometimes, in Muslim anti-Semitic discourse, they always complain about how the Jews are controlling the media. And then I often pick up in this, their problem isn't the fact that the Jews are controlling the media. The problem is the fact that we, the Muslims, are not the ones controlling the media. So our problem isn't with imperialism. Our problem is we're not the ones who are running the empire at the moment. So liberation theology broke from that political Islam because it did not only reinterpret the exclusivist claims of political Islam, but it also reconceptualized many of its ideas on the questions of gender, religious pluralism, poverty, sexuality, HIV and AIDS, and even drug addiction. The second conflation is that of liberation theology with liberal theology. I've often sat quite stupefied and offended as being introduced as a liberal theologian and as the author of Quran, liberalism and pluralism, rather than the author of the Quran, liberation and pluralism. So here the proponents have caught a general whiff that liberation theology is something nice and cuddly, and that it deals with freedom and it opposes dogmatism. They embrace these values and they dress them in Islamic terminology without any concern for the essential and indispensable tools or the ideas of liberation theology, which are essentially threefold. The first is the conviction that it does not emerge in the academy as modern theology does, but it emerges from praxis and in solidarity with the poor and the oppressed. Number two, that it is ceaselessly committed to challenging domination in all its forms, not only that of religious authoritarianism. And number three, that it focuses on communitarian values and class issues, rather than entirely on liberal freedoms, which does not offer a critique of, let alone a challenge to unjust and sinful economic systems. Now, many of our non-Muslim audiences who are keen to find carbon copies of themselves and desperate to have their own fears allayed and to be assured of the innocence of Muslims, they're simply too lazy to be bothered with distinguishing between the two. So, just a word about my location. Some of you, as came out in bits of the introduction, I cut my teeth in the struggle against apartheid in the 70s and in the 80s. And in Pakistan, during my 8 years there, I discovered how otherness is not about black and white. How otherness and the demonized otherness can be Christian, but very selectively Christian. Only the darker-skinned Christians were treated like this. If you were a lighter-skinned Christian, if you were a Goan Christian, then we needed you as an air hostess, as a secretary, because you speak English well and you are lighter-skinned. So here, religious persecution was also connected to discrimination on the basis of color. But I also became aware in Pakistan of how women were being treated exactly how I, as a person of color, was being treated inside apartheid South Africa.